What if I told you one of the deadliest epidemics in the history of the Americas is not the one most people can name?
Right, because most people would probably say smallpox, maybe plague or influenza, something familiar.
Exactly. But this one is different. This one is a historical ghost. It swept through New Spain in the mid-1540s, killed on a staggering scale, and to this day, people are still arguing over what it actually was.
I hate that already. I hate a disease mystery. A murder mystery, fine. A haunted house mystery? No thanks. But a millions may have died and we still can't fully agree what caused it mystery? No. That's rude history.
Well, rude history is kind of our specialty.
It really is.
Today we're talking about the mystery disease that wiped out New Spain, the epidemic of 1545 to 1548, often called Coco Leslie.
And it's not just a medical mystery. It's also a story about empire, conquest, drought, labor, fear, and the way a catastrophe can hit so hard that it changes how an entire colony works.
It's one of those events that should be way more famous than it is.
Which is weird because if you heard the number first, you'd think this would be in every textbook, every documentary, every dramatic voiceover montage.
Instead, it kind of lives in the shadow of the better-known diseases of the Columbian Exchange.
Which is saying a lot because the shadow is already horrifying.
So let's go back. Mid-1500s, New Spain. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire is still relatively recent. Colonial systems are being imposed, indigenous communities are already dealing with violence, forced labor, tribute demands, displacement, and earlier waves of disease.
Which is an ugly point people sometimes flatten. They talk about epidemics like it's just fell out of the sky equally on everybody.
Right? But disease never lands on a blank surface. It lands on bodies and communities already under pressure.
Weak nutrition, disrupted agriculture, forced movement, crowded labor systems, bad sanitation, social breakdown. That all matters.
It matters a lot. And then into that world comes this epidemic. It's fast, it's brutal, it's mysterious. Descriptions from later accounts include intense fever, terrible weakness, and bleeding.
Which is exactly the kind of symptom list that makes everybody start arguing. Because bleeding can point in different directions. Fever can point in different directions. And historical descriptions can be vague, exaggerated, translated badly, or filtered through people who didn't have modern medical language.
Exactly, and that's the part of why the debate still exists. We're trying to reconstruct a medical disaster from colonial era reports, archaeology, climate evidence, and later scientific study.
So basically, everybody is doing forensic work on a 16th century nightmare.
That is a very good way to put it.
Thank you.
Before we get into the theories, let's sit with the human scale of it. Because this thing doesn't just kill a lot of people, it seems to have killed with shocking speed and on a staggering scale.
Which is one of the details that really hits. This wasn't some slow creeping misery in the background.
No, this had impact. This kind of impact people noticed in empty homes, in abandoned fields, in labor shortages, tribute collapse, food shortages, and then the sudden silence where communities had already been.
And that's one of the darkest parts of historical epidemics to me. Not just the dying, but the silence after. The interrupted routines, the tools left where they were, the meal that never got finished, the road that suddenly feels too quiet.
Yes, we think in numbers because numbers help us grasp scale, but numbers also hide texture. This was village after village, family after family, worker after worker, elder after elder.
And because it hit indigenous communities especially hard, it accelerated a demographic collapse that was already underway after conquest.
Which means this epidemic didn't just belong to medical history, it changed colonial history.
And that's the key. That's not a side note, not weird trivia, one of those events where disease becomes part of the machinery of empire.
Let's talk about the name for a second. Coco-Leslie. That comes from Nahuatl and is often translated broadly as pestilence or plague.
Which is ominous already.
Very ominous. And it tells you something important. For the people living through it, this was not a neat little clinical category. It was a catastrophe.
It was the sickness, the calamity, the thing that tears through and wrecks everything.
And one reason the epidemic stays hard to pin down is that it may not map perfectly into a single modern disease label, the way people want it to.
People really want a clean answer. They want somebody in a lab coat to point at a chart and say, "Good news, everyone, it was definitely this one."
History does not always cooperate.
It very rarely does.
There are basically two big ways this gets discussed. One is that Coco-Leslie may have been some form of hemorrhagic fever, possibly tied to the environmental conditions in Mexico, and may be worsened by drought and ecological disruption.
The other is that at least part of the outbreak may have involved Salmonella paratifi, C, based on ancient DNA found in some remains from the period.
And before anybody thinks one of us is about to declare one side the winner or no, we are not doing that because the honest answer is still debated.
Which makes this both fascinating and deeply annoying.
Well, let's start with the drought angle, because that's one of the eerie parts of this story. Some researchers have argued that the epidemic lined up with the severe drought conditions in the 16th century in Mexico.
Which immediately raises the question, how does drought connect to disease?
Well, there are a few possible ways. Drought wrecks food production. That means malnutrition, stress, weakened bodies, migration, and competition over resources. And if the disease involved animal hosts or changing ecological relationships, drought followed by rain could reshape how humans and disease vectors came into contact.
So the environment itself may have helped set the trap?
Right. And that's one reason this story feels strangely modern. It reminds you that health disasters are often environmental disasters and political disasters at the same time.
There is no clean separation. You don't get to say, well, this is just biology. No, it's weather, hunger, labor, crowding, coercion, sanitation, movement, power,
And conquest.
and conquest.
Because Spanish colonial rule had already disrupted older systems of life. Communities had already been uprooted. Labor was extracted. Tribune demands pressed hard. And once populations are forced into new arrangements, disease dynamics can change dramatically.
Which is the part empire never wants to advertise.
Oh, definitely not.
Come for the silver, stay for the catastrophic epidemic.
Dark, but accurate.
Thank you.
Now let's talk symptoms, because this is where the story goes from grim to downright terrifying. Historical descriptions associated with Coco-Leslie include high fever, severe headache, weakness, bleeding, and frighteningly quick progression in some accounts.
The speed is what gets me, because when people started getting sick, there may have been very little time between, I feel terrible, and this is fatal.
And in a world without modern germ theory, without antibiotics, without virology, without any real way to isolate the cause quickly, what do you think is happening?
You think the world is breaking.
Exactly.
You think God is angry, or the air is poisoned, or strangers brought a curse, or your town has been marked, or the season itself has gone bad.
And to be fair, when enough people die quickly enough, those explanations do not feel irrational. They feel like attempts to make meaning out of terror.
Also, if I saw people with fever and bleeding dying around me in a matter of days, I would not be calm and analytical. I would be having the worst week of my life.
Oh, most definitely.
One thing I find especially haunting is how an epidemic rearranges ordinary decision making. Everything becomes risk math. Do you stay home? Do you flee? Do you help the sick? Do you avoid them? Do you keep working because tribute and labor demands do not magically pause just because half your region is collapsing?
And that's another ugly colonial detail. Empire often keeps demanding output even as the human foundation beneath it is crumbling.
Which creates this disgusting loop. People are already weakened and pressured. Then disease hits. Then the same system that helped make them vulnerable is shocked by labor shortages and starts changing how it extracts work.
Right? That's why this epidemic matters so much historically. The mortality was not just tragic, it was structurally transformative.
So, let's paint the picture. Fields are under stress from drought. Communities are dying. Communities are trying to survive under colonial demands. Then sickness tears through. People die fast, labor disappears. Food systems wobble, markets strain. Administrators panic, clergy panic, families panic. Everybody is living inside a demographic cliff.
Ooh, that phrase is good. Demographic cliff.
Thank you, I hate it.
Same. One of the easiest mistakes in history is to treat population loss like an abstract graph. But when the drop is this severe, everything downstream changes. Who works the land changes, who controls land changes, who demands tribute changes. Even which policies seem necessary to the colonial state can change.
Which brings us to labor.
Yes, because when indigenous populations collapse, colonial systems do not suddenly become humane. They adapt.
Important distinction.
Very important. This epidemic contributed to major labor and tribute disruptions in New Spain. And when administrators and colonialists faced the reality that previous arrangements were no longer producing what they expected, they adjusted.
Not because they had a moral revelation.
Usually not.
More because the machine was malfunctioning and they needed another way to keep it running.
There you go. So when people say the epidemic accelerated labor change, that can sound dry, but what it really means is that the mass death reshaped the practical terms of exploitation.
Which is bleakly efficient.
And horrifying.
Also, this is why the epidemic is pivotal. Not just because it killed so many people, but because it helped reorganize colonial society in the aftermath.
Yes. A lot of history gets written as kings, wars, decrees, and conquests. But epidemics are political actors too. They can redirect policy by sheer force.
And in this case, the force was body count.
A grim, but yes.
I'm in a grim mood today.
It fits the topic.
Fair enough.
I also think there's something important in how forgotten this epidemic feels compared with smallpox. Smallpox is famous partly because it's easier to name and it has a clear place in public memory. People know what it is.
Whereas this one sounds like a whispered argument from the back row of an academic conference.
Coco Leslie lives in that uncomfortable zone where the effects are obvious, but the cause is not fully settled.
Which makes it harder for pop history. Pop history likes labels, it likes certainty, it likes villains with name tags.
And here, the villain is part disease, part drought, part conquest, part colonial upheaval, part scientific uncertainty.
Which, honestly, is more real.
Much more real.
Let's talk about the salmonella theory, because that grabbed a lot of attention when ancient DNA studies suggested Salmonella enterica paratyphi C from epidemic era remains.
Yes, and what made that so striking is it gave people something concrete, a candidate, a microbial suspect.
Finally, the detective board had yarn.
Exactly. But even then, it did not necessarily close the case.
Because finding evidence of one pathogen in one context does not automatically explain every symptom in every account across the entire epidemic.
Correct. And that's where careful historians and scientists pump the brakes. Ancient DNA is powerful, but interpretation matters. If you still have to ask, is this the main cause, one cause, a co-infection, a regional factor, or something present in some victims but not the whole picture?
Those are less sexy headlines. Major historical debate remains complicated. Not exactly clickbait.
But it is honest.
Which we support on this show, even when it's less dramatic than I would prefer.
Meanwhile, the hemorrhagic fever interpretation still appeals to a lot of scholars because some of the symptoms descriptions sound so severe and so fast-moving, especially the bleeding.
Though historical symptom reports are tricky because words shift, translations blur, and observers often describe what frightened them most rather than what a modern clinician would have written in a chart.
Exactly. So multiple diseases can sometimes circulate in a vulnerable population. A disaster this big might not fit our desire for one single neat answer.
Which is terrible news for people who like tidy endings.
And excellent news for Weird History podcasts.
There it is.
There it is.
Another thing I keep thinking about is who gets remembered in these stories. Colonial documents often preserve the perspectives of administrators, clergy, physicians, and elites, but the people who suffered the brunt of the epidemic were overwhelmingly indigenous communities.
Yes, and that matters profoundly because when we talk about morality, labor, tribute, and demographic collapse, we are often seeing those realities through records produced by the very society benefiting from conquest.
Which means even the archive has power baked into it.
Exactly. So part of telling this story responsibly is not just marveling at the mystery disease, it's recognizing that people most devastated by it were living under colonial systems already doing them immense harm.
In other words, this is not a spooky standalone puzzle. It's part of the violence of empire.
Yes. And once you frame it that way, the question changes a little. Instead of only asking, what disease was this? You also ask, why were the conditions so deadly? Why were these communities so exposed? Why did the effects become so massive?
Which is usually the better historical question anyway.
I think so.
Because disease is never only about the pathogen. It's about the world the pathogen enters.
That line is worth underlining.
Please do, preferably in haunted ink.
Let's imagine central Mexico in the middle of this. Dry landscapes, fields under stress, people already carrying the trauma of conquest, rumors traveling faster than certainty. One settlement hears another village has been struck, then another, and then another.
Suddenly, distance starts to feel fake. Every road becomes a possible route for bad news.
And because the disease was so terrifying, the emotional climate matters too. Fear becomes part of everyday life.
Which changes behavior. Maybe some people flee and carry infection with them. Maybe others stay put and starve. Maybe care collapses because healthy people are afraid to approach the sick. Maybe burial practices are overwhelmed.
Then the colonial state is watching all of this partly through the lens of administration. Tribute, labor, order, supply, production.
Which is such a chilling angle. Imagine living through the mass death and somebody above you is also thinking, yes, tragic, but what will this do to our output?
That is one of the ugliest through lines in colonial history.
Also, in a lot of modern history, frankly.
Unfortunately, you are correct.
Another reason this episode sticks is that combination of scale and uncertainty. If the cause were fully settled, it would still be a major story. But the fact that it isn't settled makes it even more unsettling.
It does, because uncertainty lets the horror breathe. You can't lock it into a neat little box.
It resists closure.
Exactly. And the more I read about it, the more I come back to that word pivotal. Not famous enough, not simple enough, but pivotal.
Because by the end of it, you don't just have a disease outbreak. You have a colony with fewer people, altered labor realities, disrupted food systems, shaken institutions, and a deepening sense that the post-conquest world is being remade by death as much as by decree.
That is incredibly well said.
Thank you. I contain multitudes and doom.
Yes, you do.
Let's zoom out for a second. There's a temptation when talking about epidemics in the Americas to tell a very simplified story. Europeans arrive, old world diseases spread, indigenous populations collapse. That broad outline matters, but it can flatten local complexity.
Exactly. Because not every epidemic was identical. Not every region experienced the same disease in the same way at the same time. And Coco Leslie stands out because it seems to have features that don't fit neatly into the most familiar imported disease narratives.
Which is why historians keep coming back to it. It's a reminder that the biological history of a conquest is messier than a one-sentence summary.
And the social history is messier too. Indigenous communities were not passive in this story. They were living through, adapting to, resisting, mourning, surviving, and interpreting catastrophe in a real-time scenario.
That's important, because sometimes history writing turns whole populations into scenery for empire. And they weren't scenery. They were people carrying the burden of all this.
Exactly. And when that burden became unbearable, the colony itself changed shape.
There's also something almost cruel about how overshadowed this epidemic is. It's like one of the biggest disasters in the hemisphere got filed under complicated, maybe later.
That is exactly why we're dragging it into the light today.
We are. Welcome to the light. It's terrible here.
Very on brand.
Thank you.
I want to spend a minute on the emotional side of historical uncertainty, because I think that's part of what makes this story linger. It's not just that scholars disagree. It's that the disagreements reflect the limits of what catastrophe leaves behind. Epidemics destroy lives, but they also distort records. They leave panic, fragments, hurried description, burial grounds, administrative reactions, and later retellings. Then centuries later, we come in trying to reconstruct what happened.
So in a way, the uncertainty is part of the wound.
Yes, exactly.
And maybe that's why the story sticks. Because the missing certainty feels appropriate. A disaster this huge should leave scars that don't resolve neatly.
I agree with you. But I also don't want the mystery to become the whole show, because sometimes mystery can accidentally turn suffering into a puzzle box.
Good point.
The real center of the story is not that modern scholars enjoy arguing, it's that countless people died, communities were shattered, and colonial society lurched into a different form afterwards.
So the mystery matters, but the consequences matter more.
Bingo.
Let's talk scale one more time, because even cautious estimates are staggering. We are not dealing with a bad season of illness here. We are dealing with one of the most devastating epidemics associated with colonial era in Mexico.
And that happened quickly enough to shock the entire system around it.
Which means this is the kind of event where ordinary calendar time breaks. Before the epidemic, during the epidemic, after the epidemic.
Yes, That is how major catastrophes divide memory.
And if you were a survivor, after would not feel like recovery. It would feel like a changed world.
Think about it. Fewer neighbors, fewer workers, fewer elders, fewer rituals done the same way, different demands from colonial authorities, different pressures on land, different fears when a fever starts.
It's haunting because the disease doesn't end when the outbreak ends. It keeps echoing in institutions, family lines, property, and labor.
And that might be the best way to understand its historical importance, not just as an epidemic, but as an echo chamber for everything colonial Mexico was becoming.
So if somebody asks, why should I care about a mysterious disease from the 1540s? That's why.
Because it helps explain how New Spain was transformed not only by conquest and policy, but by demographic catastrophe.
And because it reminds us that the most important events are not always the ones people recognize by name.
There you go.
Also because weird history is often just the giant thing no one talks about enough.
Honestly, that could be the slogan.
I suppose it could be.
Before we close, let's do one honest summary. What do we know? We know a massive epidemic hit New Spain in 1545 and the years immediately after, especially devastating Indigenous communities. Contemporary and later descriptions include fever and bleeding. Mortality was enormous. The epidemic happened in a colonial setting shaped by violence, extraction, and disruption. Environmental stress, including severe drought, may have played a role, and the aftermath helped reshape labor and tribute realities in the colony.
And what do we not know with total certainty?
We do not know with total certainty the single definite cause in a way that satisfies everyone. A hemorrhagic fever model has long had supporters. Ancient DNA evidence has made Salmonella paratifici a serious candidate in at least some context, and debate remains alive.
Which means the title still stands, Mystery Disease.
It does.
Grim title, but an accurate one.
And maybe that's the final eerie note here. One of the worst epidemics in the history of the Americas still refuses to introduce itself clearly.
It leaves a trail of death, transformation and argument, and then vanishes back into the archive.
Which is exactly the kind of history that gets under your skin.
Thanks for hanging out with us in the plague fog.
That is the least inviting tourism slogan of all time.
Come to New Spain, 1545. No, don't.
Absolutely do not.
This has been the mystery disease that wiped out New Spain.
Brought to you by gxworks.
And if this episode made you look at history a little differently,
or made you newly uncomfortable with how often disaster and power work together,
then we did our job. Share, like, and subscribe.
We'll catch you next time. Good night, Dave.
Night, Ren. Come for the silver. Stay for the epidemic. Come for the silver. Stay for the epidemic. Come for the silver. Stay for the epic. Motherfucker. I come up with a solution that gets worse. Oh. Come for the silver. Stay for the I should have pre-read that word too. All right.
Oh. Maybe you should see what another word could be for that.
Come for the silver, stay for the epidemic catastrophe. Come for the silver, stay for the catastrophic epidemic.
There you go. Okay,
Come for the silver, stay for the catastrophic epidemic. Come for the silver, stay for the... Another reason this episode stinks is that it's a combination of a scale and uncertainty. Another reason this episode stinks is the combination of scale and uncertainty.
It's not stinks, it sticks.
Hey, you know what? That sticks. All right, good catch, good catch.